LOL take two. LOL take two. LOL take two. Now listen. When we last left our hero, me, there was a reckoning happening at my 19-year-old mom's apartment, and the players were my mom's parents, May and Lloyd, my dad and his mother, my Grandma Jo, and, well, frankly, me, though I was still womb-bound. You see, my mom was with child, and major drama was taking place. My dad's mom, Grandma Jo, who had been widowed at age 33, stepped up and took charge. Grandpa Lloyd wanted the kids to be married immediately by a justice of the peace. Grandma Jo calmed everybody down and assured them that the kids would be married in a church. She would see to it. I think this is where my full circle journey began with my Grandma Jo that lasted for the next 42 years. A scant 8 months later, I was born, and no, at 10 pounds 2 ounces, I was not premature. In fact, before I was born, the doctor had sat my mom down and said that I was going to be twins. She was that big. Twins? My dad was a student in college, and my mom didn't work. The phrase "they didn't have a pot to piss in" was more like they didn't even have a Dixie cup to piss in. Who does when you're in college? I certainly didn't during my college poverty days, and I hadn't even sired any children. Now, back in the day, you went into the hospital, gave birth, then had a week to recover while they took care of your baby. It was such a deal. Kind of like going to a Sandals all-inclusive resort with 24/7 infant care on top of it. You were able to recover, relax, and get some sleep while you geared up for the lifelong job of taking care of your newly spawned monster that awaited you in the nursery. And it didn't cost hundreds of thousands of dollars either. But you did have to write a check for your new rugrat being born before you left the hospital. My mom remembers my Grandma Jo helping out and writing the check to spring me from the hospital. So if our full circle journey hadn't begun when I was womb-bound, it certainly did when she basically paid for me to be born. Even though my mom and dad did get married shortly after the reckoning, my Grandpa Lloyd wasn't speaking to either of them. My poor Grandma May would have to go down to the payphone at the end of the street to call my mom and sneak out to see her daughter and new grandchild. One time Grandma May was watching little infant Tony. She got me all washed up and smelling good and put me on a blanket in the middle of the living room floor while my Grandpa Lloyd read the paper. Grandma surreptitiously watched as I fussed, and Grandpa looked over his paper at me like I was some kind of annoying spider on the floor. In a short time she looked again, and Grandpa was making faces and finally holding his new grandson in his arms. When my folks were heading back to university, Grandpa asked to see my mom in the basement. Mom went down. He apologized. Mom apologized. They both cried and hugged and never spoke of it ever again. I like to think I was the catalyst for that. Their own little goodwill ambassador in diapers. After that, home movies show us sharing holidays and birthdays with both grandparents, May and Lloyd and my Grandma Jo. No, my folks still didn't have a lot of money, but there was a lot of love in those movies. And that's all a kid really wants, right? A couple of years after I was born, my Grandma Jo, at age 50, began the next chapter of her life. She left the TV station she had worked at for 13 years and started the next career that she would stay at for the rest of her working years. She became a house mother at universities. Her first gig was at a men's dorm, Toller Hall at Briarcliff College. They provided her with an apartment so she didn't have to pay rent. She got 3 months off every summer, and best of all, she got to hang out with college kids, something that kept her young for many years. During her 3 months off, she would make the rounds of her family. She never drove, so she'd hitch a ride with a friend or take the Greyhound bus and would stay with us for a month. My father was now a traveling salesman and was out on the road, usually Monday through Friday. Having Grandma Jo to ourselves was fun. She refinished furniture, made homemade egg noodles, and watched all the plays I produced in my garage. And every day at 5, Grandma would get cocktail hour together. A martini for her, a scotch for my mom, and they'd nibble on smoked oysters and crackers. Yeah, my brother and sister and I had to wait until it got dark for dinner, but we loved having Grandma Jo there during those summer months. After I moved away to college, my folks announced they were getting divorced. Unfortunately for my mom, that meant losing touch with her favorite mother-in-law. It happens. I was in Los Angeles, and Grandma would usually come out to visit my dad, and so I'd get to see her in California. She always wanted to know how and what I was doing, and always quietly asked, "How's your mom doing?" I was starting to have some success in show business, and she always told me how proud she was of me when I saw her. Finally, Grandma Jo retired and settled in an apartment in Kansas City where her daughter lived. Now, this was a 3 hours drive from Des Moines, where my mom still lived, and on my trips to Iowa to visit my mom, we always took a day trip to visit Grandma Jo. We'd leave for Kansas City in the morning, take Grandma out for barbecue lunch, and visit for a couple of hours, and then drive back. Yeah, it made for a very long day, but we always enjoyed our time together, and the drive seemed to go by faster once we hit the Missouri state line because we could start playing Count the Roadkill. 2005, in her 90th year, Grandma Jo was beginning the final chapter of her story. That year was a new chapter for me as well. After having written, produced, starred in, scored, and edited a successful short film only 5 years earlier, I dove in and did the same duties on a full-length feature film. I got some investors who financed the whole movie, hired some great actors, and cast myself in the leading role as one of two brothers. The guy playing my brother was going to direct, and I was the executive producer. I mean, how hard could this be? And I just knew that this project was going to be a huge hit and elevate my career to all new levels. Never again would I ever have to go back to the typing pool. We shot the movie over 10 days, filming 10 pages of script each day, which is a lot. We shot most of it in my house with a crew the director had chosen. The first day of filming, one of my lead actresses, a TV star, called and claimed that she had some flesh-eating disease and her face had swollen up and she had to quit the project. She was supposed to start filming the next day. I had to call the actor playing her husband, another TV star whom I had worked with and who had given up an Adam Sandler movie to do my low-budget movie. When I told him she said her face had swollen up, he said, "How would we know?" We replaced her with a good friend of ours who ended up being way better than the original actress. Still, this kind of foreshadowed the direction this project would take. We had done our homework and meticulously planned the shoot because time and money were so tight. But that all seemed to go out the window once filming began. It became the director and crew versus the rest of the cast, investors, and me, its co-star and executive producer. Delays were racking up overtime, which was cutting into the money we needed to finish the movie. In the movie script, the director and I played estranged brothers who make up in the end. In reality, we were friends at the beginning of the shoot, and by the end, we weren't speaking. After the 10 days in hell shoot, the investors told me to dismiss the director and finish the movie myself. We filmed in June, and all summer I sat in my office editing, and it just wasn't coming together like I had imagined it in my head. We had wasted so much time. I didn't have adequate extra footage to even try and put things together differently. And slowly, this horrible feeling of dread and disappointment began hitting me in the gut. I was realizing that this probably wasn't going to be the fabulous, successful indie film that I had hoped it would be. I felt like I had let everyone down. You know the old adage, don't bite off more than you could chew? I had bitten off more than I could bite, but I plowed ahead on the editing. Back in the Midwest, Grandma Jo was starting to fail and ended up in a nursing home. Since my summer was spent trying to salvage the movie, I had scheduled a trip back to the Midwest for late November and would see her then. My dad called me in early November saying that if I wanted to see her, I should probably go out earlier as she was deteriorating quickly. I let my mom know, changed my flights, and arrived in Kansas City November 8th. My mom had driven down from Des Moines, and my father was there from San Diego. My brother worked for Marriott and got us cheap rooms in the same hotel. This was really the first time my mom and dad had spent any time together since their contentious divorce 21 years before. Yikes! How was that going to work out? When I arrived at Grandma's nursing facility, in her room was her daughter, my aunt, my dad, my mom, plus this couple I was allegedly related to, I have no idea how, who basically just sat on chairs at the other end of the room. Grandma Jo really wasn't responding, but her eyes were open. My aunt had given her a gorgeous manicure, but Grandma's hands and arms were just skin and bones. Her hospice nurse, this big lug of a gay guy named Seaton, couldn't have been more fantastic. He said Grandma was shutting down and that we mustn't spend all our waking hours at her bedside. We needed breaks. We needed to eat. He said Grandma couldn't respond, but she could hear us. So we hung out, laughed over family stories, and I sang show tunes to Grandma Jo. Of course, we did this for 2 full days, and on the second night, we pretty much decided to dump my aunt and the mystery relatives. We all just needed some space. So my mom, dad, and I went out for Kansas City barbecue. Now, it hadn't been just the 3 of us since, 1965, before my sister was born, and everybody stepped up. Any past hard feelings were set aside, and we had a great time. We laughed, we talked about the good times. It really was one of the best nights with my mom and dad that I ever remember, and I was old enough to appreciate it. The next day, we had to change hotels so we could continue to get my brother's cheap rate. So Mom and I packed up our suitcases and bottles of hooch that we had purchased so we could have a cocktail in our room. Now, back at the nursing home, Grandma's breathing was even more shallow, but she was still hanging on. I had to start repeating my show tunes as I had gone through my entire repertoire. Late in the afternoon, my father had to say goodbye to his mom before he caught a plane. We took our places at Grandma's side. My aunt right next to her mother, my mom and I on each side of Grandma Jo, each holding a hand, and, of course, the relatives I don't know how I'm related to on their chairs across the room. My aunt, who had been a nurse, quietly said, "She's going," and placed her hand on her mother's heart. We looked into Grandma Jo's eyes, and soon the life behind them was gone, like a candle that had slowly but quietly burned out. Nothing dramatic, no death rattle. I can only describe it as this wonderful peace for all of us. Seaton, the hospital nurse, said to open the window so the energy and spirit could dissipate, and asked us to leave the room for a bit. And Mom and I made a spur-of-the-moment decision. We got our bottles of vodka and scotch out of the car, got some styrofoam cups at the nurse's station, and when we went back into the room, Seaton said they would be coming for Grandma soon. We noticed Grandma's arms, which only 20 minutes before were those of a 90-year-old, were now creamy smooth, no veins, and of course she had that gorgeous manicure. We offered a cocktail to everybody because we were going to have a toast. My aunt declined, and the mystery relative said, "I can't believe you brought booze in here." I ignored them, but I wanted to say, "Look, you don't even show up on my relative list on Ancestry.com, so just shut up." Mom and I stood over Grandma Jo and raised our glasses for one final toast. We thanked her for all the decades of love and sacrifice, for being a fantastic mother-in-law to my mom, and for being a fabulous grandmother to me since the beginning of my life. We walked with her out to the awaiting van and said our final goodbyes. Mom and I, needless to say, had more cocktails back at the hotel. We were spent after this experience, but amazingly, not sad. No, we were so grateful that we were there for her when she had been there for us. It really was a gift to us. When I returned to LA, I had to finish the movie. After my trip back to the Midwest, it kind of put the movie angst into perspective. No, it probably wasn't going to be a career game changer for me, but you know what? I promised the investors I would finish it, which I did. And life went on to my next chapter. A friend of mine who had become a hospice nurse and had been with hundreds of people when they passed told me she believed that at the end, people die with people they choose to be with. Had my Grandma Jo chosen to be with me at her end as she had been there for me at my beginning? Wow. I like to think so. Grandma Jo and I truly had come full circle, and I remain forever grateful for her and for our journey together. LOL take two. LOL take two. LOL take two.